If you haven't done so yet, go ahead and try to number the statements on your own in pencil in case you need to make a correction. Otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and proceed. It's up to you. You know what you want to do. So we have a statement right here. So it goes from lines A through D. We're going to number it, statement 1. Then we've got this one right here, statement 2. Then we've got statement 3. Then we've got, okay, so this is statement 4. It is asked then simply, okay, blah, 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 we already read that. Right here, you should have said that this is statement 5. This is statement 6. And this is statement 7. And this is statement 8. Okay, so how did you do? Did you identify all 8 statements? I've analyzed this passage many times, so if you're confused, if maybe you think I did something incorrectly, I can guarantee you I did not. Maybe you don't, maybe you're still mastering the concept of a statement within philosophy. So I invite you to review the definition of a statement and how we've pulled out statements from other arguments. So there's a confusion there if you think that something is not a statement, or that there's more statements, or that there's less statements. All right. So now, at first we were just doing a conceptual analysis. We were just looking for the concepts to look at what the theory, to see the theory in action in terms of the concepts that were being applied. Now we're going to look at how the theory is being applied in terms of reasoning, the concepts informing the reasoning. So of course what we're using is intellectual empathy. We're using theoretical intellectual empathy or philosophical intellectual empathy. We could call it philosopher intellectual empathy. We're trying to see how, we're trying to put ourselves imaginatively in the place of Kant to see how, to understand the structure of his concepts and how they hang together to inform how he gets from his reasons to his conclusion. And we're doing that whether or not we agree or disagree with him. We're trying to think through his concepts as he defines them. And he's trying to show us here. So make sure you're practicing intellectual empathy even if you don't totally agree with him. Okay, so right here, what we're doing is we're getting the context right here. Okay, so we're getting contextual information. So you might want to write a note out here that lines A through D are giving contextual information. They're describing something that supposedly one could go through, generating a scenario, right? Imagining a hypothetical case. And it could be that someone right now really is contemplating suicide. If they're a Kantian, then they're going to make these kinds of moves. They're not going to think about the pain and the pleasure for themselves. They're not going to think about pain and pleasure for their family or friends. None of that matters. Remember, we don't think about the subjective conditions of our actions with Kant. We focus on what reason tells us is right or wrong, independent of our situations, feelings, inclinations, pains, and pleasures, independent of practical consequences, psychological consequences for others. Okay, so this gives us the contextual information. Now we are told that he inquires, he's asking himself whether the maxim of his action could become a universal law of nature. Okay, so we've got the scenario. Then as a Kantian, he realized that he needs to think about what the maxim of his action would be. In other words, what would be the subjective rule that he would be generating were he as a particular individual to act on what is stated in lines A through D. So he realizes, step 1, as in the book, he generates the maxim, the subjective personal rule that he would be generating if he were to act on his inclination stated in A through D. And all of this is using reason. He's using a rational Kantian agent would only use a priori rational thinking to think about whether something's right or wrong. And that's what's going on here. So that's another lecture point that you need to write. Maybe down here, put this is an example of using a priori thinking, a priori reasoning to decide whether something is right or wrong. Okay, so again, this is an example of how you use or think through something in an a priori manner to decide whether something is right or wrong. Okay, so moving on. So really, this is contextual information right here, lines 1 through 2. 3 is where he's actually generating the first premise, if we're going to call this an argument. Okay, so his maxim is, and really, this would just be considered excess verbiage, so we would cross that out. I've not taught you guys to do cross out excess verbiage, but we're going to do that in this particular scenario. So this is the maxim of his, oh no, actually no, we wouldn't cross this out. This is important, so leave that in there. So this would be a premise. So notice that statement 3 is actually premise 1. Then step 2, it is asked then simply whether the principle founded on self-love can become a universal law of nature. So that turns out to be another premise. So statement 4 is premise 2. As a result of texting this maxim, so we are interested in results, but the result is not an empirical one in terms of thinking about practical consequences like actual pain or pleasure, actual practical advantages or disadvantages, actual psychological consequences like happiness or unhappiness. That's not what we're thinking about with results. So this does not indicate that he's a consequentialist. He's talking about the result of using a priori thinking, okay? The result of thinking through concepts and whether or not a rule can be universalized. So that's what he's talking about, the result of a priori thinking. So as a result of testing his maxim, we see at once that a system of nature of which it should be a law. Okay, so this right here, this one's arguable. It could be a premise or it could be a conclusion, but we're going to go ahead and just say that this is a premise. So it's a finding, if you will. Okay, and then we get our first conclusion indicator. Where do you see the first conclusion indicator after statement 5? You should say therefore. So this is functioning as a conclusion. So as a result of premises 3, 4, and 5, as a result of generating a maxim, trying to universalize it, and seeing that it cannot be universalized, he concludes, this person, this rational agent, that the maxim, the subjective rule of his action, cannot exist as a system of nature. It cannot be deployed. Then we get another conclusion that hence that maxim cannot possibly exist as a universal law of nature. So we can't make it a moral law. And consequently, you see another, right, 3 conclusion indicators. It would be wholly inconsistent with the supreme principle of all duty. So that's saying that because we can't universalize the maxim into a moral duty or principle, we see that that would not be consistent with what he calls the core categorical imperative that you use to generate the duties. So as it turns out, this is what's called, you might want to write this down, this is a complex argument. This is just a general note about what's going on here. So just a general note. Of course, you should have a lot of stuff already written on here. Complex argument. Okay, and a complex argument in this class means that it has at least one conclusion that is also used as a premise en route to a final conclusion. So a complex argument is one with at least one conclusion that is also used as a premise en route to a final conclusion. So let's see what that is. So all of these, so 6 is derived from 3, 4, and 5. So that's a sub-conclusion because 6 is first a conclusion that's supposed to follow from 3, 4, and 5. But then 6 is used to support 7. So then 6, and I titled that sub-conclusion. That's what I title conclusions, statements that are first conclusions, but then that conclusion itself is used for a premise for another conclusion. So 6, which is first just a conclusion, is then used to support 7. That's why it's a sub-conclusion. So sub-conclusions are statements that function as a conclusion at some point as an argument and also as a premise at some point in an argument. In this case, statement 6 first functions as a conclusion, but then because it's used to support 7, it functions as a premise. We call those sub-conclusions. So 7 is a conclusion, which is then used to directly support 8. Since 7 was first a conclusion, and then it was used as a premise to support 8, we're going to label that sub-conclusion, SC. So make sure you remember what SC stands for. Then statement 7 is used to directly support 8. That is going to be our final conclusion. So a final conclusion is the statement in a complex argument towards which all others aim. So a final conclusion is a statement that you find in an argument that includes at least one subconclusion, and it is the one towards which all other statements aim. So your final conclusion is supported by at least one other subconclusion. There could be 2, 3, or just one, and any other statements that function only as premises. So let's just review real quick. According to our analysis, how many statements are merely contextual? Important, but contextual. That would be 2, statements 1 and 2. How many statements function only as premises, just giving support for the final conclusion? That's 3, statements 3, 4, and 5. What is the first statement that functions as both a conclusion and a premise? Statement 6. What is directly supporting statement 6? 3, 4, and 5. What statement is directly supported by statement 6? Statement 7, right? So how many statements in this argument do we have that function as both a premise and a subconclusion? 2, 6, and 7. And then what is the one statement towards which all others, the 3 premises and the 2 subconclusions, what is the one statement that all of those are aiming at? Our final conclusion. In this class, whenever I give you a complex argument, the final conclusion always comes last. Okay, so now you've got an idea of what it looks like to apply the categorical imperative. Just so you know, the first conclusion says the maxim itself cannot exist. That means that as a personal rule to act on. And then in statement 7, he's saying that means it cannot be universalized, right? So it's not one that we can turn into a moral rule that everyone should follow. So that is the main conclusion for the actor in this argument, all right? And because this maxim, cannot be universalized, then it is realized in the last statement that this maxim that cannot be universalized would be inconsistent with the supreme categorical imperative. So this whole thing was an attempt to imply the main supreme categorical imperative. In doing so, in the second subconclusion, the agent decides that it is not a duty, it's not something that can be universalized, and we see that, yes, you can't say that this is a duty to be generated by the categorical imperative. Now, because we see that his maxim cannot be universalized to end one's life whenever you're tired of it, that in turn tells us that we actually do have a duty. So sometimes learning what we cannot do tells us what we must do when we apply the categorical imperative. And in this case, it's telling us that we have a strict duty not to do what? We have a strict duty not to kill ourselves. So we still generated a duty applying the categorical imperative by stating the maxim and trying to universalize it because we found a contradiction. We said that that can't be a duty, killing yourself whenever you're tired of life. But we also found what is a duty. So the duty is that we have a duty to not kill ourselves, to not commit suicide. All right, so that's what you have for that example. I'm going to have you answer some questions. Listening to this lecture and taking notes will help you. You still may have to do a little bit of critical thinking. So you're going to you're going to answer some questions and submit them, and then keep it handy because you may need to refer to this for your final writing assignment.